we're going to go ahead and get started with our CPTPP panel, or as the incoming Trump administration is calling it, the TPP panel. So, to get started, I think everyone on the panel is known to everyone in the room, but we'll just go down very quickly. Of course, we have Hugh Stevens, former ADM with Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, back before it was GAC. Also a fellow at the Asia-Pacific Foundation. Had a great paper with CGAI a couple years ago. A really deep, comprehensive look on Canada and the CPTPP. Sooyeon? Sooyeon, sorry. As you know, I'm just off a plane from China. I landed 5 a.m., so I'm still struggling up here today. But at UBC, associate professor, she's also editor of the Pacific Affairs, right? Pacific Affairs, and a chair funded by the Korea Foundation. So a great example of an Indo-Pacific partner investing in Canada. The Korea Foundation funds conferences, events, but also chairs in foreign universities, and they're just starting to move into Canada. So good to have you join us. I'll go to the very end. We have Paul Jenkins from C.D. Howe. He's a former senior deputy governor at the Bank of Canada and had a great article out in April, I believe, sometime this spring, on the TPP. Very good reading. And of course, Jeff Mahon, you know from the earlier session. I'll just add to his bio, and we should have done a conflict of interest disclosure at some point. Jeff is also with the Canada West Foundation as a senior fellow, and he was the editor of our China brief, which we hope at some point to resurrect. So that's our panel, and let's get started with the big question, which is how is the TPP doing? But first, let's get started with a quick overview, a snapshot of, Sue, if you could, of what the TPP is.
Like this. Hello, can everybody hear me? Very good. Hi, my name is Sooyeon Kim. I'm a new faculty member at the University of British Columbia. I moved here from Singapore. After 14 years at the National University of Singapore. I moved here in July, so very much a newbie to Canada. I'm delighted to talk to you about the CPTPP. My research area is trade agreements, or the politics of trade agreements. So the CPTPP, I'm pretty sure around the room I am talking to people already in the know, so I'm just going to note just a couple of things just to start off the discussion, right? The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. It has 11 members, affectionately known as Oceans 11, right, including Canada. It used to be Oceans 12, as you all know, when the U.S., of course, was also a partner country in the predecessor agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP. Of course, the U.S. withdrew on the first day of President Trump's administration, or sorry, President-elect Trump's administration. Some of the things to note, I think give us a good starting point for the discussion. It is a mega FTA, what we know as a mega FTA. The latest or the newest model, a 21st century model, if you will. It has many members, 11. Right? It is also large in economic size, so 13.5% of GDP as of, I think, 2022. So it's a large agreement. It is considered a high standard agreement with provisions that are intended to facilitate the flow of goods across supply chains, including new, provisions on e-commerce and such, right? What is also interesting about mega FTAs, I might note, is that it often will consolidate existing trade agreements. So among the 11, right, CPTPP members, there are about 17 FTAs, all of which have been consolidated under this one umbrella agreement, the CPTPP. In a practical sense, it consolidates a lot of the rules as well, right? So one of the noted achievements is a single rules of origin. So anything you produce across the 11 member countries can contribute to conforming to what is called the rule of origin right, requirement. If 45% of your production takes place in the 11 member countries, you can export using preferential rates in any of the other 11 countries. I will be happy to go into more detail on that, but it's a very complicated topic, I know. The second thing to note, it has competition. At the time that it was signed and put into effect, it was the largest trade agreement known of its kind, like, to date. However, by 2022, we have another trade agreement. That's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. And of course, in Asia, geopolitics is never far away, right? It has 15 members, right? ASEAN 10 plus 5, including China, Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So that is the geopolitical dimension. You will note, of course, in both of these mega FTAs, the US is absent, is not a member. So when we look at, from the trade agreement's perspective, the institutional architecture governing trade in Asia in the 21st century, the US is absent, or formerly absent, from these institutions. The last thing to note is more a broader context, and that is the CPTPP exists or operates at a time when there is increasing, what I might call, I don't want to say crisis, but I might at some point, disarray, disorder in the international trading system or trade governance. Right? In the 30 years since the World Trade Organization has been established, there has been no successful multilateral trading round. So much of trade governance, all of trade governance, if you will, has been taking place through these trade agreements that have been either bilateral or multilateral. All right? The WTO itself at the present is, that I would say is in crisis. Right? The dispute settlement mechanism, its crown jewel, is paralyzed, right? Because the appellate body does not have enough judges, or the politics has prevented it from having enough judges to effectively implement the dispute settlement mechanism. So these three things, the fact that CPTPP is a mega FTA, that there's competition, especially in Asia, and that it exists in an era of protectionism, or as we literally brace for what is to come, if it should all come to pass under the second Trump administration, we would like to think that an agreement like the CPP might be one way in which members or signatories or countries committed to a liberal trading order can hold it up by continuing to fulfill commitments. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks for that overview. It's easy to jump into these discussions and forget our history with the agreement. So that really sets the basis for going ahead. Hugh, going ahead. Sue mentioned the origins of the agreement, but when the agreement was faltering after the Americans pulled out, Canada almost killed the agreement. But yet, here we are years later, and Canada's hosting the chair of the CPTPP. So how has Canada done in that interim, and how have we done with the taking the reins this year?
Yeah, thanks, Carlo. Canada has an interesting history with the original TPP. It wasn't interested initially, and then tried very hard to get in. I think Ed Fast, when he was the minister, made the rounds of every TPP capital, asking, some say begging, for Canada to be admitted, and then we were. And then the U.S. left, as you say, and the remaining partners resurrected it under Japan's leadership, and there were a couple of crisis moments where Canada wasn't quite ready to sign on, and the others were prepared to move ahead. And anyway, the good news was that we were, in fact, one of the signatories, and we're one of the first 6 to ratify, so we were on the ground floor in 2018. And as you mentioned, this year 2024, Canada was the chair of the CPTPP process. So technically it was the chair of the CPTPP Commission. What is the Commission? It doesn't really exist. It's kind of a virtual body. It's the senior officials and the ministers coming together a couple of times, I guess, over the course of the year virtually, and then culminating in the Commission meeting, which took place in Vancouver last week. New Zealand was the chair last year. Australia is the chair next year. So we have 3 kind of like-minded partners shepherding the process. And the chair has an important role to play in terms of setting the agenda, moving things forward, providing leadership, and so on, recognizing that there are 11, and in 6 days' time there'll be 12 when the United Kingdom accedes officially. As we've seen with ASEAN, sometimes things only move at the slowest pace. So to respond to your question, how has Canada done? What's its grade been this year? Frankly, I would say it's been pretty mixed. And I think in doing that evaluation, it's fair to look at what Canada set out as its priorities at the beginning of the year. And I'm going to read from it because there's a certain amount of what I would call tortured prose, because we have to get the words comprehensive and progressive into everything. So, the CP part of the TPP was Canada's contribution, because if you recall at the time, this was, I guess, 2016, and the Liberal government had just come in, and we had signed the CPTPP. And I remember asking Chrystia Freeland at one point, at that point she was the Minister for International Trade, well, how are you going to convince the people of Canada this is good for them? There was a lot of anti-TPP rhetoric around. And she said, it's not my job to convince anybody. We're going to sit and listen and see what the people of Canada have to say. And so Canada, ragged the puck for a while. And then eventually the progressive trade policy emerged. And I'm not sure where the comprehensive came from, but I guess, actually comprehensive means inclusive. I'll come to that in a moment. So for Canada, the 3 priorities set out in January of this year were, first of all, progressive stewardship of the agreement. So what does that mean in plain English? That means updating the agreement. It's a living agreement. It is now 6 years old, and it was negotiated a couple of years before that. So there's need for more work. So progressive stewardship. The second objective was comprehensive utilization. Note the word comprehensive. What does that mean? That means inclusive trade, SMEs, women-owned firms, indigenous businesses, and so on. And the third priority for Canada was to develop, and I think these are key words, an effective path forward for accession. And that was qualified by referencing the so-called Auckland Principles, which is that to be qualified to join an economy, to use APEC speak, had to be qualified, i.e. it had to be ready to meet the dress code or the standards of the agreement. It had to have a proven track record, and most important, there had to be consensus. So develop an effective way forward. So I said the results, in my view, were mixed. They were better in some areas than in others. So specifically, let's take a look at those 3 categories. First of all, in accession. Some of you may know that in Vancouver last week, the Vancouver Statement, as it's called, the communique, announced that the way for accession will be open for, wait for it, Costa Rica. Now, I hope there are no Costa Ricans in the room. I have nothing against Costa Rica. It's a nice little country with the emphasis on little. So there are at the moment, including Costa Rica, 7 aspirant economies, as the word is called, countries that have applied to join. And that's in addition to the United Kingdom, which is just in the verge of succeeding. So and I'm not sure if I have the exact order, but certainly the first was China 3 years ago. 6 days later, Taiwan applied. I think Taiwan was ready, so China beat them to it. There's Uruguay, Ukraine, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and now Indonesia. So there's a whole slew of countries that have indicated formally indicated, not just sort of talked about it like Korea's talked about it, but actually formally registered their application with New Zealand, which is the depository country. And so the question is, how do you move ahead? Well, for the last couple of years, it's always been, well, we've got to deal with the United Kingdom, so we can't get around to that. But there are some specifics in the agreement. It's all laid out as to how accession is to proceed. There's an article, and it talks about dealing with applicants within I think the wording is a reasonable period of time. Anyway, not kicking it down the road forever. And so what Canada was supposed to be doing was developing a process. So the process has reached out to, I think, the one that was 4th in line, and to say, okay, we'll set up a working party for you, but hasn't dealt with the real elephant in the room, which is the China-Taiwan question, which is difficult. Let's admit that it's difficult. Taiwan, certainly in my view and the view of many others, is clearly qualified. It's passed all kinds of legislation to meet the terms. It's a member of the WTO. It's a member of APEC. It has met its commitments, but it's lacking consensus. China, if China ever met the dress code of the CPTPP, it would be a very, very significant event, but it's not ready to move forward either. But the question is, was there something else that could have been done? There have been various proposals floated, associate membership, starting everybody off and then letting the ones that can move fast to move ahead, all kinds of what I would call creative proposals. None of those came to fruition. So I think it's quite disappointing that there was no movement forward on that particular issue. On the other two, on the updating, there was an announcement of sorts that work was going on. Digital trade was identified as an issue, and it's a very, very important issue. But in terms of, excuse me, actual details, it doesn't seem to be a lot there. Now, saying that, I recognize that we're all on the outside looking in. We don't know what happened. We don't know if things were almost ready. But I just want to read from the communique on where things stand in terms of updating. So the agreement was that the officials are continuing to work toward making recommendations in 2025 to establish preambles for negotiations to update and enhance the agreement, et cetera, as relevant. Now, talk about tortured prose or heavily negotiated prose. That's a real mouthful. It basically says nothing, and there's certainly no deadline there. So I think that's also quite disappointing.
The last one?
And the last one, I'll get to it, which of course is comprehensive utilization or inclusive trade, which is something that's near and dear to Canada's heart. And I should say to a couple of other economies, New Zealand and Chile, although not everybody sees inclusive trade through the same lens. But I think there has been a pretty impressive program of inputs, seminars, expansion of a couple of agreements, which you may not have heard of, a couple of acronyms, the GATAGA, the Global Trade Agreement and Gender Arrangement, and the Indigenous Peoples Trade and Economic Partnership Cooperation Agreement, and a couple of others. So they're underway. More countries are joining. There's been lots of activities in terms of Team Canada missions, women-led Team Canada missions, et cetera. The big problem is measuring it, empirical evidence, something I think that all the parties recognize. Nonetheless, that certainly has moved ahead, so I would certainly give Canada a better grade there. So say a B or B plus or something like that. So overall, it's been mixed. Some progress, but certainly a lot more to be done. And I will be personally hoping that we've laid a foundation for Australia to do some, bring some real deliverables to the table next year.
Pass the buck to Australia.
What's that?
Pass the buck to Australia.
Yes.
Uruguay was the other one, and well, why are you picking on Costa Rica? They were my favorite candidate to go ahead. Take the easy one first.
It's a great place to visit.
Okay, so that takes us down to Paul. So we've had a little overview of the wide range of things discussed in Vancouver. A lot of time spent on some of the progressive elements. How are we doing on the economics with the agreement?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel today. I am a bit of an odd person out, not being a trade expert and being a former career central banker. But what I would like to do is try to provide a bit of a top-down, broader perspective on a couple of issues, drawing on the paper that Carlo mentioned. The paper is one that I wrote with a former colleague, Mark Kruger, and it was published by the CD Howe last April. And the title of the paper was Furthering the Benefits of Global Economic Integration Through Institution Building, Canada as chair of the CTPPP in 2024. I'm not going to talk about the CPTPP specifically, but what I would like to do is, in these few introductory remarks, talk about some of the research in our paper that provides a context for thinking about some of these trade issues. Now, the word fragmentation has certainly been used quite extensively today and much more broadly. And when we think about the fragmentation of the global economy, there are multiple reasons, both economic and geopolitical. Now, the IMF did a very interesting analysis dividing global economic integration into 5 different cycles. The first being the industrial era, the second being the interwar era, the third being the Bretton Woods area, the fourth being the liberalization area, and then the fifth being what they call and others have been using as a characterization as slowbalization, which really began to take hold around the time of the global financial crisis in around 2007, 2008. Now, the metric that they used was global exports plus global imports as a percentage of GDP. So it's an outcome-based measure, if you like, and very, very useful in terms of gaining some insights. In addition to this analysis of the cyclical aspects of global economic integration, they did what I thought was very, very useful and insightful modeling of the implications of further fragmentation. And they were going at it at a very aggregate level, macro level, if you like. Now, I'm not a trade expert, as I mentioned. I think a lot of the modeling work that has been done over the years on trade has been at a more micro level. So this was an attempt to try to get a broader macro perspective using different models. And of course, with all models, there are many caveats that one needs to be careful of when you use them. But their work showed that the risks of further fragmentation range from a decline of global GDP of between 1.5% and 7%. Now, that might strike you as a very wide range, and indeed it is. And with each of those, they had different assumptions about the degree of technical barriers and trade barriers and so on. But the point I would make is that I would not view, even though a wide range, that those being an upper bound, because the assumptions that they made, one could have pushed those even further if you wish. So as an indication of the degree of impact of further fragmentation, I thought that provided some very useful insight. Now, in our paper, what we wanted to do was take a little bit more of a granular look at this issue of fragmentation. And so what we did was we looked at data from a Swiss institute called KOF, K-O-F. And they have data on over 200 countries, data going back to 1970. If you haven't looked at this data, you really should. It's very, very good. And what they do is they put together indices of globalization across a number of different metrics. And the ones that we focused on were their economic indices of both trade and finance. And not only do they look at the financial side of globalization, but they also look at it from what they call a de facto and a de jure basis. Now, the de facto is essentially measures of trade and financialization, the activities, the flows of trade, the flows of financial assets. The de jure is a measure of the policies and the conditions that have been put in place to foster these flows. So it's a very rich set of data. And the 3 insights that we took from this research were, first of all, that although there wasn't a huge difference between what they showed and the IMF data, but what it certainly showed was that globalization was still trending upwards, particularly on the financial side. Secondly, what they showed was that across these various indices, that there was this very, very strong correlation between globalization and the growth of GDP per capita across all countries. So, excuse me, if if you look at these issues through an economic lens and look at the benefits of global economic integration, we found this data to be very, very convincing. But the third piece of research, and this was really the hook that we took for our paper, was that this correlation between globalization and global per capita economic growth came about through the de jure indices, thus emphasizing the importance of institution building. And so we use that as our hook as to why Canada, as chair of the CPTPP, should continue to champion institution building, as it has done over the years, even going back to the Bretton Woods agreements in 1944. So those were the key elements of the research aspects of that paper, Carlos. So I'm going to stop there, but I do want to come back to some other aspects of some of these elements when we get into a further discussion. But let me stop there.
Well, thanks. That's the economic data. At the end of the day, this is about growing trade, but the institutional angle, the building institutions, is really a key difference that we're seeing some of our problems here in North America, the lack of strong institution building. So switch it to Jeff. You recently had a piece out in the Globe and Mail. So we've covered economics, we've covered the history of the agreement. You touched on geopolitics, so give us some thoughts about where we are with the CPTPP now and the geopolitical situation.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Carlo. And I guess I should, preface my remarks as saying, we've got that good view, as Carlo said, the history, the politics, and the economic side. But if we're looking at the world today, we need to adopt a political economy lens, because neither will be able to do on their own. And I would actually add another P to that was philosophy. We need to be checking some of the foundations of our assumptions that guide not just the economic models, but have also informed the development of the institutional models. So if we're going to think about the CPTPP and some of the geopolitical challenges to it, we need to step back and take a bigger picture look. And because the TPP or the CPTP, I'm just going to call it the TPP because it's easier to say in terms of, funneling out all those syllables, but
You have the blessing.
it works for you. Thank you, sir. So the TPP didn't emerge from nowhere. There was hard economic, tangible interests at play that were needing to be secured. But there was also a philosophical interests that were driving it. And what I mean by that is the TPP emerged down of what I called in that article the dying days of the neoliberal regime. Paul just mentioned, in that IMF paper, these various phases and all that. Well, I called one, more the neoliberal phase, and it really kind of came up and started to twist and turn right around the time of the global financial crisis, which is also happened to be around the time where the TPP negotiations were birthed. And so while there was an economic interest in pushing it, there was also just this inertia, this policy thinking inertia about further rationalizing and expanding the scope of trade agreements, including like the TPP. And there was a geopolitical element about that because it comes down to the rules-based international order and the philosophy undergirding that. And so big shocker, hold your gasps, but one of the premises in driving that was the rise of China. So the TPP was birthed in one part. We wanted to get furthering this drive of the rules-based order into the engine of the 21st century economy. But it was also, there was a view by the United States and others about ensuring that the rules of the road were written by America in this neoliberal type ideas. So with that, the fact that China's been rising so much as an economic power, and economic feeds into politics, and when you couple the two together, you have a change in the balance of power in the international system. And it was this shift in the balance of power that is causing some tensions in the rules-based international order, because at the end of the day, rules only work insofar as you either agree with the rules, fundamentally they reflect the way your view of the world, or if you fear punishment for breaking the rules. So if you can get away with fiddling around the margins, then you might be able to go and do so. And I think that was one of the challenges we're facing today. I won't get into all the details of everything, but when it comes to China, sometimes it's not always about breaking the rules. It's also maybe the rules weren't fully defined and they had some ambiguities to it. Because when you look at China's track record at the WTO, you know, it looks a little bit better in that sense. But clearly there was some kind of tension. Clearly something was going on, whether it was, you know, with the letter of the law, you know, like those de jure type aspects, or if the spirit that could be impacting it. So what does all this mean then? So we've got this rules-based international order that pretty much everyone in this room probably, we've got one consensus on one thing, which is it's coming under threat. And what I'm arguing is that one of the ways that this threat is manifesting itself in terms of policy is the rise of what I call the economic security regime. And this is, you know, this is the thing that is impacting the functioning, whether it's the CPTPP or the broader world trade system. So what is the economic security regime, and how does this geopolitical mindset help shape our understanding? Well, for countries that are implementing economic security policies, there is an implicit, and again, this is my own assumption, but I think it holds, is that the goal of it is jobs and productive investment, which leads to healthy communities. Now this ties into some comments that were made in the last panel where we talked about one of the D's, development. You know, but the thing is, development's not just for developing countries anymore. Development also matters now in the advanced economies type situation. So we've got this, this goal. And it then fits into a couple different categories for economic security. And it's been a lot of debate internally in the policy realms, because when the world starts to change, everything's a little mucky and murky at times, and it takes a little while to start ironing out the kinks. And so it's kind of settled around two different themes. The first is economic-based threats to national security. And Canada's actually got a pretty good, healthy, robust system in place to deal with that, whether it is the Investment Canada Act, export controls, new research security guidelines, and the like. But then there's this other element, which is what I call long-term economic competitiveness or prosperity. And this is the notion where that, you know, that you need to protect the industrial base. You need to protect, or not protect, but you need to make sure that it's functioning properly, that the spillover effects, you know, of key strategic supply chains are resulting in jobs and growth within the domestic borders. And this is where the slope really gets kind of slippery, because if and we see it really well with the United States, if you see some kind of threat that is impacting one of your sectors, but it can't be covered fully within the current set of rules, well, then you might derogate from those rules in terms to try to deal with that. And what that means is the rules start to be ignored. They start to not have the same strength that they used to if everybody, particularly the most powerful countries, are doing it. And this is the frame in which I interpret and understand Canada's decision to put the EV tariffs on China, was that it was about protecting this emerging nascent electric vehicle supply chain. And as we all know, Canada didn't follow the WTO framework. It used Article 53. If you don't know what that is, you should read Wolfgang's article on it. It was really, really fantastic. And what that means, though, is it's the same thing as the U.S. when they did their 301 trade actions. It means you're able to step away from the rules, use your own domestic situation to skirt them, and then that's driving things. But the ultimate result from all this is there's a mindset now where we're moving away, or at risk of moving away, from a positive sum mind frame to a zero sum mind frame when looking at trade and rules, etc. And the biggest impact of that is we could get into the slippery slope where the law of the jungle prevails. And that's really where the big threat to our interests are. So the CPTPP is still there, but the question is, if it doesn't really drive the trade, and we don't have the U.S., we don't have China in there, you know, it could be a helpful little lifeboat in some circumstances, but it may not be enough to really, you know, save us from the bigger storms.
Okay. Little lifeboat in the very large Pacific Ocean, I guess is the metaphor we walk away from. So let's go into a second round of questions. We've got over half an hour, so we'll get these done fairly quickly and leave a good chunk of time. The first question will be a bit longer and a bit deeper. The second one on ascension and who's coming in, I think we can get through a bit quicker. So I wasn't here for the panel discussion. Time zone changes. I turned it over to Jeff, but I did instruct Jeff to warn the panelists that I was probably going to go off script. So, Hugh, you've done this before. You're ready for this, so we'll start with you with the first question. So, Trump, will the agreement survive a second, better prepared, better armed, better staffed Trump administration? So take something like the progressive elements of the agreement. We know that the incoming administration, if you go through the America First Policy Institute or Project 2025, plans to gut all of the progressive elements of U.S. foreign and trade policy. We saw with the TPP that when the Americans left, the agreement did not get more progressive. Vietnam took back some of the offers it made on labor concessions. Arguably, and the Center for Policy Alternatives argues this, and we agree with them, the agreement got a little less progressive. We now have New Zealand that's taken the right turn. We also have a change in government coming in Canada. So you've lost some crucial elements for progressivism in the agreement, and you have a U.S. government coming in that's potentially going to be driving the global trade conversation in the opposite direction it's been going. So do you think this will impact the progressivism in the CPTPP? And any other thoughts about how the agreement does under Trump? And then I'll hit everyone else up with this question too. So Sue, you've got a few minutes to think up an answer.
Well, let's talk about the progressive elements first. The motors for that within the current agreement are Canada, New Zealand, and Chile. So you say New Zealand's taken a turn to the right. They seem to be very, very advanced on this, particularly on the Maori file, which is very important for that country. So at the meeting in Vancouver, there was talk updating the agreement. Maybe there should be an indigenous clause, an exemption like there is in the CUSMA, et cetera, et cetera. So they're looking at areas to strengthen at least part of the inclusive trade agenda. You know, assuming we're going to get or if we get a change of government here next year, I have no idea what the incoming government's policy on inclusive trade and progressivism is. I've never heard it enunciated, but I can guess that it's going to be less forward-leaning, perhaps, than the current government. You know, that said, there were certain institutional elements baked into the agreement. Whether the updating will include expanding it and having an inclusive trade chapter and so forth, with perhaps one of the motors of that desire, i.e. Canada, having changed its position, is a good question. You know, with respect to the U.S., of course, the U.S. is not a part of the agreement, although it can certainly cast a chill on the agreement. But I think the whole point of Canada continuing to pursue it and to be pushing forward and to make sure that this is a living agreement, that it is expanded, having brought the United Kingdom in the fifth largest economy globally, is an important step. So if it's going to be a counterweight, or a dike of some sort against this rising tide of protectionism, the agreement needs to move ahead and be strengthened. Absent whatever happens in the U.S., I mean, we're going to have our own issues with CUSMA and how that's renegotiated and so forth. And presumably some elements of the existing agreement, the trilateral agreement, are not going to survive. But in terms of U.S. influence on the TPP, I think more than anything, it'll be if there is a change, it'll be the dynamics internally. And I should add that in terms of inclusive trade, Canada has one view of it, you know, gender, SMEs, indigenous, and so forth. Other countries may look at this a bit differently. Let's take as an example the indigenous file. Well, I use this as an example. If Indonesia became a member, I'm not sure. They have a separatist movement in West Papua. I'm not sure they'd be all that keen on empowering indigenous trade and so forth, as New Zealand's done with the Maoris, as Canada has done with First Nations groups and so forth. So, you know, I think it can mean different things to different people, and perhaps as it expands, some of these definitions will change.
Okay, so Sue, we have a incoming U.S. administration that's not a fan of multilateralism, that loves divide and conquer, that loves dangling carrots in front of countries to strike deals that run counter and undermine agreements like the TPP. Do we have any threat from Trump? Are there things we should be worried about in terms of the viability of the TPP going forward? Or do you think the agreement's strong enough to stand as is?
Thank you for the easy question. So I think we must first remind ourselves that the U.S. is not a member of the CPTPP. Therefore, right, to the extent that members or signatories implement the CPTPP, it has every possibility to go forward. So, but putting a geopolitical lens on it, I think makes it more interesting. The CPTPP is an agreement among what we call middle powers, right? These are countries that are sort of caught in the fray, if you will, between U.S.-China, the U.S.-China rivalry. So I had an interesting observation from the previous panel that if you in Southeast Asia somehow countries or individuals prefer China. I don't know exactly what that means, but from my years in Singapore, just sort of watching the government, how it deftly sort of navigates foreign policy, right, in such a way that it retains the United States as the largest investor in Singapore. At the same time, it does not alienate China. I think that is sort of the golden mean and the road that everyone wants to take. Right? I hold the view that no one really wants to choose, if you will, between the two, because there are there's nothing to be gained by choosing, and there are lots of economic losses to be made and political losses to be made by choosing. So this is an excellent opportunity, I think, for a new sort of, I guess, much more optimistic era of what we might call middle powers, right? And the CPTPP is one of those, I think, institutions that, I mean, again, to the extent that countries remain committed to implementing the provisions, right? It can sort of, in some ways, be a very, it is already a high standard agreement. It has the potential, right, to lead, right, trade liberalization and keep to the road of what we I don't think the liberal order is dying in any way. I think most of us would want it to continue, but it's one of those agreements that has the possibility to lead.
So, working our way down, Paul, any thoughts as to the U.S. not being a member, but its penchant for bilateral deals that underline larger deals, its penchant for influencing countries to...
I know exactly what this is, and I'll tell you. It's my grandson wanting some advice. And I'm just going to put the phone down. I'll talk to him later. I apologize. Yeah, so let me pick up on that and start off by perhaps making an assertion that I think Canada needs to get back into what I call the pro-growth game. Jeff talked about the need to have long-term competition. I would rephrase that slightly in terms of the need to promote long-term economic growth. Now, with that assertion, let me see if I can also paint a bit of a big picture here, Jeff. I would argue that today we are going through two major transformations or even revolutions, and I would be one of those that believe that we are going through one of the most revolutionary ages in history. And the two components of that are the changing world order and the digital revolution. And what has been a driving force in these revolutions has been technology. Think back to the age of, think back to the scientific revolution, the age of enlightenment, perhaps less so the French Revolution, but certainly in the Industrial Revolution, both in the UK and in the United States. And the changing world order is really, as Jeff mentioned, a result of the rise of China. And that really is, in many respects, the nub of everything you've been discussing through today. Now, the digital revolution is, I think, something that is really worth reflecting on, because it's a revolution that is proceeding much faster and is more widespread than previous revolutions, certainly the Industrial Revolution. And moreover, when you think of the Industrial Revolution, it was sort of a physical revolution. I mean, you know, steam engines and cotton ginnies and locomotives and and automobiles. The digital revolution is really an information revolution with very, very widespread implications, and is proceeding far faster in terms of the adaptation compared to the Industrial Revolution, which actually did take quite some time before most of the people benefited from that revolution. And if you're interested in sort of the essence of that, the Nobel laureates of this year, the economic Nobel laureates, Acemoglu and Johnson, their book, Power and Progress, is really all about that. But let me come back to the theme of the importance of economic growth. If you look at the U.S. economy, the digital economy in the United States counts for about 15% of their GDP. In Canada, the Bank of Canada estimates that it's about 5.5%. Moreover, the C.D. Howe Institute has done research that shows there is really a skill shortage when it comes to digital skills in this country. And we really do need to upscale Canada's digital economy if we're going to compete and grow the way we should and the way we want to. We're talking about upskilling and reskilling labor. We're talking about designing new business models to gain the efficiencies and the productivity gains that the digital revolution clearly provides out there. So I know others, Hugh, you in particular, are far more adverse on Chapter 14 of the CPTPP. But coming back to your comment, Carl, I mean, to me, you know, that seems to provide an important vehicle for Canada when you think about it from the broader global economic perspective and the importance of economic growth for Canada going forward. So I would just put a huge emphasis on the importance of being part of the digital revolution, which at the moment we're really not.
Okay. So now we're over to Jeff. You and I have talked about this quite a bit, the history of the TPP emerging as a defense as much against Donald Trump as against China. Do you think it will survive, or am I just worrying about something we shouldn't worry about?
I don't really imagine a scenario where, you know, marrying, you know, rips up the TPP and says Canada's out or anything like that. But whether or not it's a driving force is left to be seen. You know, I think your point about, you know, it's a club of middle and smaller powers that are driving, and that's kind of what I was thinking about with that lifeboat analogy there. But to answer the question on whether or not it'll survive, you know, this changing Donald Trump presidency and the different type of tactics.
And by survive, we also wither and die.
Yeah,
so
wither,
the passive
yeah,
versus
exactly,
actively ripped up.
And again, like to me, again, it's TPP is just a little dot in a bigger circle, which is again that rules-based international trading order, right? Like it's not something in on itself. The principles that turn into rules, you know, they're in line with everything that we've been doing over the last, I guess, since the end of World War II, when the U.S. really showed that leadership to build it, and now they're walking away. And I mentioned earlier when Graham Shantz made some really fascinating points in the first panel about, you know, anchoring these deals. So I'm going to come in and answer that question, and I'll just quickly remark, I've got a trade policy background. I was Nunavut's chief negotiator for the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, and while that was an internal deal, the language is built off of international trade agreements, because these things are all precedents. They built this self-containing scaffolding in a lot of ways. And I also advise clients on tactics for dealing with changing geopolitical issues. So I've spent my whole career really in the mud of all this. But I also like to hang out in the clouds. And that's why I'm going to talk about a bit earlier. I said there was a philosophical element, because I think the only way we're going to be able to, save this system is if we really stop and think about what it is we're trying to save in the first place. And that's where we need, like that philosophical aspect. So I know it's a little abstract and not everybody wants it, but you can bring it back down once you get clearer sight and figure out how to do those tactical changes. So what do I mean by all that? I think we need to probe the foundations of our values and like why we really want this rules-based order in the first place, and start reinterpreting about how those can manifest in terms of actual rules and provisions. We need to tie that back into what's actually happening in the real world today. Because if Donald Trump has come in and making these changes, it's not just because it's coming out of nowhere. He's responding, reacting, adapting, whatever word you want to choose, to a changed environment. So, the Chinese have a saying, which is, I think, wind doesn't blow from an empty cave. So clearly there's something going on there. Now, do we trust Donald Trump to be the guy to come up and fix it? Probably not. But I think that the direction actually is kind of correct. So I think we need to identify where are the actual problems. Where do the rules that we've got all of a sudden start to produce these nonsensical or contradictory results? And I think that is going to be where, the path to the solution is. Because at the end of the day, it's not these particular rules that matter, but it's the values behind them. The principle, particularly the idea that we want to actually have rules in the first place, so we got that predictability and consistency, so we're not just running into the law of the jungle and the might makes right type situation. So we need to be able to start rethinking what it is actually that is driving this challenge, and that could include trade deficits. It could include this notion of economic security and the emphasis on long-term economic competitiveness, which also I think includes your notion of growth, because I think that's really one of the big things. So we need to be able to find a way to reconcile these rules with the values that are being driven by this new economic security regime. And by doing that, we need to see where the rules are in conflict with reality, and we need to get creative. And this goes to the notion of I can't remember who it was, but in the last panel it was that autocracy versus democracy and all that. That's single-dimensional thinking. We can't be just like, this is good or this is bad. We need, we need to recognize that our relationships with other countries, including those in the autocracy side of the scale, are multidimensional. They need to be matrices. There's going to be some vectors where we're going across purposes in completely different directions, but there's going to be others where our values or our interests do line up. LNG Canada, clearly a great example there. A lot of the agricultural work we're doing at CWF in Western Canada. Someone talked earlier about the flooring issue. So there's this whole area where we actually do have alignment. And I think it's through recognizing that, trying to be a bit more subtle in our thinking by finding ways that we can actually cooperate, and then trying to address the rules. Instead of just holding on and clutching the pearls for these particular ones, we need to work with China because the balance of power shifted. We've got to be able to find principles that overlap with them and with us and others. Now, that doesn't mean kowtowing and changing everything. It means reinterpreting. And it applies for China and applies for the U.S., is rather than trying to fight against everybody, we need judo. Let's use their momentum, and where Canada and other like-minded partners actually have a value, particularly the little middle ones, is when we can nudge them. We can nudge them in the right direction. Instead of, talking about how much we dislike Donald Trump and all the different things, is ask where the real problems actually are that he's saying, and then reformulate that and say, we've got a path to get there. I think that's the best chance we're going to have if we want to save the system.
Okay. Sure.
Let's not forget that the U.S. and Canada and the countries in the CPTPP are in very different positions. I don't know what percentage of the U.S. GDP is based on international trade, but it's something around 20% or something like that, right? So, the U.S. can put up a wall, and it can damage itself for a while, and it can survive fairly well because it's got this huge internal market. What's our percentage on trade? 3 times that, something like that.
60, 66,
Yeah. So I mean,
65.6.
it's all well and good to say Trump is reflecting a certain issue of public opinion in the United States, and you know, and there's all kinds of theories about the wealth gap and the fate of unions and how things changed when employers no longer were concerned about paying their workers a living wage, but by maximizing the return for shareholders. All these different theories. But the fact remains, yes, of course, he is reflecting some of that, but we, I think, have to look at our interests, as we'll be talking about, and if we don't trade, we're going to have a much harder hit than anybody else, and so therefore we've got to grab on to what's available. This is available. It's a high standard agreement. We're in it. They're not. We've got to make it sing.
So, yeah, actually, we could have a good back and forth with this. But I want to get to the big question, the elephant in the room, and that's new countries joining. And the next question will be, from a Canadian perspective, of the list of 7, which includes Uruguay, I'm not so sure about Ecuador nowadays, but which countries would you look at from a Canadian perspective? And then which countries from the perspective of the agreement itself? And are there conflicts between those two? So which countries joining would make for a stronger agreement, and do the countries that you think would make for a stronger agreement align with the countries that would meet immediate or short-term Canadian interest in coming into the agreement? But let me just note that on the Americans and the Trump administration and the TPP, I do think that this is something that needs a deeper look. If you look at Project 2025, the trade policy written by Peter Navarro, who's now in a senior trade advisor, there was a dissent in the trade chapter. Ken Lossman called for the U.S. to rejoin the TPP. And he repeated the word TPP 3 times in his dissent in the chapter. So there's a lot going on, maybe not so much with the Trump administration, but certainly within the America First movement and the think tanks that are working on this, and the people who will be staffing trade positions in the administration. So I think that's something to keep an eye on. Yes, the Americans aren't a member, but there's a chair at the table that they still occupy, even not being a member. So, ascension. We've got 7 countries. Let's see if we can do this. China, Taiwan, Costa Rica, Ukraine, Ecuador, maybe, and Uruguay. And for China, just as a note too, we can take China off the list. No one thinks that China is going to come in. China is doing deep, extensive work on testing CPTPP rules. I had deep technical discussions with them about this point by point, walking through with the free trade zones that are testing the rules. It's a question, there are 2 questions here. Can China technically meet the requirements? And a second question, does it matter or do we trust them, even if they can meet them? So I think technically they can, but what they're doing is testing the rules to improve Chinese competitiveness. Joining the TPP is a secondary consideration. By being able to demonstrate that they can meet the rules and making necessary domestic reforms to meet them, they're strengthening their domestic competitiveness, their trade competitiveness, and they're signaling to other countries that they're doing so. So let's take China out of the equation and look at the remaining countries. Taiwan, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Ukraine, and who did I forget?
Indonesia. Did you say Indonesia?
No, I didn't say Indonesia. Have they formally?
On the 15th of September.
Okay, so they did recently. Okay, so, and Indonesia. So, who wants to start? Jeff?
I'm going to channel my inner Carlo Day, and I'm going to be like, wow, that's a fantastic question. I love it, and I'm completely going to not answer, and I'm going to go back to something different. You can tell I'm a protege of yours, so I don't like to color in the lines too much. And I actually, you know, that's kind of, to me, it is a good question, but I think Hugh kind of led us on to something related. So, like, yeah, if we grow some of these other economies now, I think someone mentioned earlier at the outset that Costa Rica, sorry, you know, no offense, Costa Rica, but it's not going to be a game changer. I think we can say that basically with all of those economies. They're not going to be game changers. Hey, they grow the size of the market that the CPTP has scope for. But I don't think it's going to alter like the fundamental issue, because at the end of the day, these regimes, they need to be anchored on something. It'd be fantastic if the small group of middle powers and with including some emerging economies who are signed on to the deal for development purposes, by the way, right? Like they want to follow that tried and tested path of using trade or export-led economic growth development, which I think is going to be less viable in the near term. But what I want to pick back up on is this whole notion of dealing with the American side of the things in the Trump. So Hugh, you said that Canada is trade dependent and the U.S. is not. But Donald Trump, again, I don't know if people saw it, he called Prime Minister Governor Trudeau today in a tweet and brought back this whole notion of Canada being, the 51st state. He wanted to go back for a victory lap on that joke. So Canada's trade, is, I think we flagged earlier, is 2/3. Like, what's the percentage that goes to the U.S.? About 70% of our total international trade?
77.3% last year.
So all of a sudden, if Canada does become the 51st state, and I don't mean actually in the real world, like our trade, we're actually not that much of a trade-dependent economy, because it's all really going into one market. And yes, if that comes into threat, like we're in big-time trouble. So these agreements and expanding the scope is great if you open up the space, but are the companies driving on the highway? We got the CETA agreement, we've got the TPP. But we haven't made a dent in what our trade balance actually looks like. So sure, let's get everybody to sign the agreement, but unless people start driving on the highway, it's not going to make a real big difference.
That's an answer that I would have given.
I told you, I'm your protege.
No, a little bit of pessimism. Yeah, our trade with the U.S. has gone up over the last 3 years, and our trade with the Indo-Pacific 16 has gone down. So an inverse relationship. Despite having signed new agreements and having new attention.
Two-way trade has gone up. If you read the Asia-Pacific Foundation's report, where it looks at the 7 countries with which Canada does not have a bilateral agreement, trade has definitely increased over the last 3 years, although we always think of trade as being Canadian exports. In fact, the largest growth has been Vietnamese exports to Canada.
Yeah, two-way trade. You're good catch. That was exports. Hang on, Jeff. Let's go to Paul. We're running out of time.
Okay, well, very quickly, I don't see the relevance of the question. And what I mean by that is it seems to be too technical a question, as opposed to wanting to think much more at the strategic level. And so let me, again, make a couple of points here. What happens next to globalization, in my view, doesn't depend on the Trump presidency. We're in a multipolar world. Other countries are stepping into the game, with a notable number of them trying to stay non-aligned, and I suspect a number of them are here today. And if you believe that technology is one of the most important driving forces today as a result of the digital revolution, my view would be that these countries are after technology first and foremost. So what this adds up to me is not so much which country should get into the CPTPP next, but it adds up to what I call creating space for an open global economy. That's the strategic objective here, and that's what we should continue to move towards. And as a very final comment, Carla, I want to pick up on something I think Kai said, and I think one or two other people, maybe it was in a hallway conversation, that I really do think governments in Canada need to engage Canadians in a broader-based conversation than just about our relationship with the United States. We have to have that conversation. We have to move down that path. We have grown as an open global economy, and we've been a champion in the past, and we've got to get back on that horse, if for no other reason than to promote Canadian economic growth, which at the moment has many, many serious problems associated with it.
Okay, so relevance and the aspiration that we can look beyond the U.S. finally. Okay, so Sue, you get the last word.
Thank you. So Taiwan, one of Canada's major trading partners, right? Top 6. So accession of Taiwan to the CPTPP will allow them even, I guess, better trade tariff rates. Indonesia, again, would be great, because then you would be picking up 5 of the 10 ASEAN countries. Right, so 4 already in the CPTPP. If you pick up Indonesia, they've got 5. That would greatly facilitate the Canada-ASEAN FTA negotiations that are currently underway. Because I think that would be to Canada's benefit. So on the last word, I had to put this on a sort of a negative note, but I think the greatest threat to the CPTPP is actually would be China's accession. I know you want to take it off the table, but there's more than this. It would put the USMCA at great peril, no? If China were to accede, there is a provision in the USMCA that would nullify really the US obligations toward Canada if any of the members were to conclude a trade agreement with an authoritarian country. So Chinese accession, I think, if yes, it's not going to happen, okay, but to the extent that it's ever like on the table again, would be the greatest threat.
Actually, no, the 3210 allows a country to call for consultations, review the agreement, et cetera. The U.S. has signed a phase 1 agreement. I think they timed it right before the CUSMA concluded. So we've had agreements with non-market countries. Whether or not the Americans trigger it, it's not automatic, is the point. It was put in to scare us away. And once again, we bit on the Americans playing us. But yeah, so it's not impossible in a technical sense for us to do it, but I think from an all intents and purposes, we've already made the decision without having the trial. We didn't wait for the evidence in the trial to come, and the jury's already ruled and the verdict's out, unfortunately. But the benefits for China are not necessarily in joining, but demonstrating to the rest of the world that they can. So, let's open it to questions before Bijan comes up and takes the microphone from me. We've got 2 microphones. Please queue up, and we'll see how many questions we can get to. So let's start on the left-hand side. Could you please give your name and affiliation?
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Queen Chen, Chief Trade Representative of Vietnam to Canada. And I'm also from the Vietnam Ministry of Industry and Trade, the negotiation team of Vietnam to different free trade agreements. I would like to have some comments and one question. First of all, with the 8th ratification, now the UK is the 12 official members of the CPTPP, and from, I think, in 5 days, 9 countries can free trade with the UK, but not Canada, because it still not ratified the UK accession. The second comment I would like to add is that the fact in 2023, our trade office in Canada has organized a roadshow across Canadian provinces to raise awareness about the CPTPP and how to help companies to use and to reap the benefits from these free trade agreements. And similarly, Canadian colleagues in Vietnam at the embassy in Hanoi and consulate in Ho Chi Minh City did also the similar roadshow in Vietnam. And with our efforts, the trade between the 2 countries has increased significantly during the last 2 years. For example, from Canada to Vietnam, the export has increased this year more than 30%. And among our different findings, after 5 years of implementation of the CPTPP between Canada and Vietnam, we found that for Canada, the the effect of the CPTPP is not always positive with partners, but it do have positive effects. I mean, the spillover effects for Canadian export to ASEAN countries. And now ASEAN is the fifth largest trade and the fifth export partners of Canada, much bigger than Mexico, and it's something that not many people here can know. The third comment is the fact that I do think the name of the panel is the trade challenge. And I do think that the biggest trade challenge now is the Donald Trump tariff. And it's not only Canadian specific issue, but it's the issue for all countries that have China components in the export. And I do think that with the...
I cut you at 3. So the rule of threes, 3 comments.
Yeah.
So we'll...
So now I come to the question.
Okay,
so
this question, good, okay.
So I do think now with the Donald Trump tariff and with the fact that Canada and ASEAN and Vietnam and many countries, we have a lot of free trade agreements. So we need to count on the free trade agreements to help companies not to decouple from China, but to de-risk from China by helping companies to raising the CPTPP value contents in our products, for example. So do you think that it's now the urgent time for CPTPP countries to soften the rule of origins and also to accept the cumulative origin in our production system? It's my question. Thank you.
Anyone want to take that? Paul, maybe, or? No, Paul's passing. Sue, do you want to take it? Is it time to ease the rules?
I'm not sure I understood all the whole question, but I will say this about trade relations between Vietnam and Canada. They're going to be even more important once President-elect Trump takes office, because Vietnam has recorded now the 4th largest trade deficit with the United States. So it's likely to be one of the upcoming targets. So trade relations between Canada and Vietnam are going to be especially important in the coming years.
Anyone else, or should we move to Jeff?
I'll be very... All right, mic on? Yeah, there it is. I think yes, but with the caveat. So I mentioned in my opening remarks about this notion of the export-led development and some of the risks coming to that. So TPPP is ultimately it's a global value chains agreement. It's meant for creating the conditions so that you can have investment, do some production there, and then integrate into global value chains. And I think it is that logic is what is kind of has helped pull the United States out of the agreement in the first place when that happened. There was a bunch of Trump officials back in 2016 who were making that argument. So I think, like, yes, it is a plausible strategy, but the only question is that at cross purposes with the bigger things happening right now today in the political economy of trade agreements?
The rules of origin.
That's your question with a question.
Yeah, the rules of origin liberalization is a good point. We've seen moves by China to recently zero out tariffs for all LDCs. So we have seen moves to increase openness in face of the moves to impose higher tariffs. So we have the Americans talking about 100% tariffs on developing countries, and China, meanwhile, moving to a greater openness by talking about zeroing out tariffs. So a similar initiative to increase openness in the face of pressure to decouple, de-risk, may actually warrant some discussion.
My name is Colin Scarf with PCO. My question is for Dr. Kim. Given the substantial ties between the PRC and Indonesia, who would be more concerned about them joining CPTPP? Would it be the PRC or would it be the USA?
Sorry, can you say that?
Which country would be more concerned, the PRC or the USA?
About Indonesia joining the CPTPP? That is a very, very difficult question. I'm not sure that either would be necessarily affected by Indonesia joining the CPTPP, since neither party is an agreement, and neither is a party to the CPTPP. I'm not so sure on this.
China's an RCEP, but still.
China's an RCEP, yeah, but I mean they are in the same agreement. Yes, very good. China and Indonesia are both in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Right. To the extent that, to the extent that you have these countries that have common membership in both of these mega FTAs, I think these countries are going to be really, really key. Indonesia, if it becomes a CPTPP member, will be one of those pivotal countries. So as to whether there's hostility towards it, I guess the media will tell us.
Hugh, did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, no, just to say, I mean, of course, there are some members that are in the CPTPP now and are also members of RCEP. I mean, there are crosswalks. I think I'm correct in saying that the TPP is a higher standard than the commitments that they have in other agreements, so it's not negative in any way. I don't see either side, frankly, take a position on it, nor should they. Frankly, it's none of their business.
The world as it should work, right? So let's here and then back over. So your name and institution, please?
Javadusan Qureshi, I'm also with the Privy Council office here in Ottawa. I guess my question is more around the lack of the conversation we've had up till now on India. I cover India and it's sort of my big interest. But in the context of the CPTPP or RCEP, which India walked out of in 2016, and I have my own views why India walked out, domestic factors, China, others, international factors. I'm just curious in terms of India now actually having a well-articulated international trade policy. The successor to the Planning Commission is now publicly advocating for India to join both RCEP and CPTPP, as well as Prime Minister Modi being able to deal with some of the domestic protectionist measures within his ruling party. Why is India not part of that larger conversation about re-engaging in RCEP, but also being invited in CPTPP, especially when now it is concluding bilateral free trade agreements, less ambitious multilateral free trade agreements too, with the 4 European nations and whatnot. So I'm just curious why India, both as the rising sort of well, a big middle class now, but also a regional hegemon for a lot of Western countries, including Canada, as we look at China. It's not part of the conversation, and I wonder if it should be as you guys see it.
Okay, who wants to take India?
Well, I can talk briefly about India, briefly because I'm not an expert, but as you no doubt know, Canada and India have been trying to negotiate a free trade agreement for quite some time, and it's broken down in part because of political factors, but I think also in part because India is not ready to assume the kind of obligations that are necessary to make a real free trade agreement work, and that's the reason they were unprepared to meet the relatively low standards of the RCEP. I don't want to dismiss the RCEP, and it has certainly some good attributes, but India wasn't prepared to meet that. India, as I'm sure you know, has always played a very what should I say? I want to use the word obstructive, but that sounds extremely negative. But it's defended its own interests very vigorously in the WTO. So India is not ready, I think, and maybe it's becoming ready to take on the obligations of more open trade. But its particular industrial model has not lent itself to that for quite some number of years.
Jeff, anyone else?
I was going to say it much less eloquently.
Yeah, the difficulties with India are legion. They were able to negotiate with Japan, but the complementarity there led to an easier agreement than we could ever, I think, have with Canada. And being asked politely to leave RCEP so that they could include the agreement, I think, is a warning to others, or a note of caution for others as well. Name and affiliation?
Hi, my name is Steve Zhu. I'm a research scholar with the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. My question is more related to investment. Trade and investment are kind of two peas in the pod, so I was hoping maybe you could answer some questions about whether CPTPP offers an opportunity for a more diverse set of investors in emerging technology sectors in Canada, such as AI. I was wondering if you can get your appraisal for that, whether more in order for Canada to attract more investment in that sector, whether the CPTPP might have to lower barriers, or if that's a viable option at all. Happy to hear your thoughts.
So, Paul, anything from your research on that?
Yeah, I don't think I can comment on the specifics of what's in the CPTPP from the point of view of diversity from an investor's point of view. But I think one element that does hold out great potential is when you think about investment more generally. There's a great deal of research, analysis, discussion, debate around the importance of intangible investment as opposed to bricks and mortars. And so much of economic analysis, economic models have been built up around the definition of capital that is essentially bricks and mortars. And so much more is now needed in the way of intangible investments. I mean, we're talking about IP. And so, I mean, my sense is that sort of the e-commerce elements of the CPTPP do offer greater opportunities from that point of view. But I'm not familiar enough with all the specifics of the agreement to answer your question directly. But I do think to the extent that investment and the definition of investment needs to be broadened out in terms of how we think about it, that the CPTPP does offer some potential there.
Any other quick comments? We're actually into the time for the next panel, so we're going to have to cut it. But anyone want to throw in anything real quick? Okay. Jeff, I'll cop to mixing up exports and imports. I should have used the Asia-Pacific numbers. But thank the panel, and we're all up here. If anyone has questions to follow up, I know we had a bunch of people at the microphones. But once again, thank our panelists, and welcome to the next panel.